We operate in an interesting time in an interesting field. The IT or cybersecurity space is really changed. I mean, I'm an old man, so I remember way back when I started my career in cryptology in the Navy. I mean, then we were dealing with mainframe computers. So my mobile phone is probably a million times more powerful, but the computer I was programming, which was analog computer programming, if you know what that is, was basically, the computer would fill 10 of these rooms. It was something like the Raiders of the Lost Ark type environment where you couldn't see the end of the room. It was just so big. So the world has really changed. But bad guys are bad guys. Cyber criminals existed then, they exist now. They're getting smarter, they're stealthier, and they also have some great tools. When we think about the cyber criminal, you know, I remember 8 or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was maybe a high school kid kind of locked up in the bedroom working. But now the cyber criminal is part of a syndicate or even a nation-sponsored attacker, and we're seeing more and more of that. The environment, the war with cybercrime is just getting harder, and that's why we need tools. That's why we need to have people with certain skills. That's why we need good governance processes. Most of all, we have to change organizational culture, because we'll talk a little bit about that as well. A lot of organizations have a culture that's not necessarily supportive of a strong security posture, despite all of the headline news coverage in USA Today just today, and it's a big story, but for whatever reason, there's a gap between you, the people who do the work, and the CEOs. And Mike, we love you, but CEOs of corporations sometimes are a couple of notches removed from the real world of security. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So without further ado, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this study. Now, I'm not sure if this is our official title. It may change a little bit when we publish it, but this is about security incident response. And we also will focus a little bit on the C-suite awareness. This is just one of the key findings. There are other findings as well. I'll also alert you to a couple of anomalies. I know, Tom, we were kind of dealing with issues with the way people responded to questions that may suggest that there's kind of a general, not general, but some misunderstanding. Well, I want to kind of bring that up as well. I think it's important. Okay, but the infomercial. Ponemon Institute is a very boring company because all we do is research on 3 things: information or cyber security, data protection, and privacy. We started the Institute 12 years ago, and we're very, very pleased to have built this reputation. We work with an affiliate network globally, I think in 26 or 27 countries. And this gives us an ability to take research to kind of the next level. We've published hundreds of studies, and we also have a group of very distinguished individuals called the Ponemon Fellows Community, Distinguished Fellows of the Ponemon Institute. I see Phil here, and Phil is actually the chairman of that distinguished group. Thank you, Phil, for being here. Phil is the CISO for Cox Communication. And Tom, bottom line is Tom Cross is officially now a member of this distinguished group. So anyway, just want to let you know that it's something else that we do about advancing new knowledge, and trying to make a difference. I know Mike and I were talking last night. The nice thing about being on the good side of security, dealing with solutions, helping companies understand the problem, is we're basically like, it's better to be the white knight than the black knight, right? It's better to be the good guy than the bad guy. And I think we're the good guys. I hope we are. About this particular research, the research is independently conducted by Ponemon Institute and sponsored by Landcope, but unlike a lot of the projects that we do where the sponsor says, hey, go away, just do the research. We like the topic and we want to be associated with it. This was more of a collaboration in designing the instrument and thinking about the questions that were most relevant. Now, it's conducted independently by our institute, but the actual creation of the instrument and also the analysis of results has been a really great collaboration. So I would like to say it's more, if there's a way to say it, more than just simple sponsorship, because I feel like it's a partnership and one that will hopefully continue in the future. Now, before we get into the specific findings for Landcope, the Landcope study, I'd like to talk a little bit about some other findings to show you some preliminary, maybe not preliminary, but some evidence on the economic value of incident response and security intelligence systems. Gartner has its magic quadrant and has its definitions of different categories. I think Gartner has a good handle on these things, but we actually have different definitions because it's not what you do technically, it's what problems you solve. That becomes a category for Ponemon Institute. And the problems that you're solving is around the whole area of getting smarter about your systems and your networks. We call that security intelligence systems. It's a Ponemon category. It doesn't kind of map perfectly to Gartner's categories, but it's close. And in that category, it would be Lanco. But there would be other companies that have different types of technologies, but they're attempting to solve the same problems. And very impressed, by the way, with Lanco. Independently, we also work with other companies who may be in the competitive space, but what you're doing really is top-notch. And I was telling Mike, I was in the UK last week, and Lanco was mentioned, the Gartner guys were talking about movers and shakers, more or less. And you guys are a mover and shaker, according to their presentation. So it's not just me talking. It seems like you created this, this image, and it's not just an image, it's the reality of what you're doing. Your success is evidence of that. Okay, let's look at some of the numbers. This is our most recent cost of cybercrime. This particular research is sponsored by HP, and it was just released last week in the UK and also globally. We actually did this study in 6 countries. I just want to call your attention to the US data. The US data shows $11.6 million as the annualized cost of cybercrime. This is the cost that organizations incur in just trying to deal with and respond to attacks. It does not include the value of intellectual property exfiltrated. If you basically included that, it's probably more like $100 million in some cases where the companies are losing information, which is their competitive advantage. So it represents a pretty big nut. 26% of that 11.6, that's the increase from the prior year. So it's not just a flat number, it's a number that's on the move, which is bad news, right? You normally see an increase, it's usually a good thing. This is actually a bad thing. Now, in terms of the value of having security intelligence technologies, what might that look like? We actually did that in this study, and we actually came up with a $4 million annualized cost savings for companies deploying these intelligence solutions, but I want to say with one caveat, across the enterprise. If you're not doing it across the enterprise, you're treating it as a point solution, you're not going to get the full value. So $4 million is quite a nice value on average, but keep in mind that's just an average. There are some companies in some industries where that number is 10 times, 10x that, like defense contractors, aerospace contractors, and some of the financial service companies. We also calculated an ROI. Now, if you know me, I don't like ROIs very much because in the security space, an ROI is really, really hard to measure. In order to do an ROI right, you basically have to have a net present value that is pretty stable. Like when you say, in the next 3 years, we're going to get this benefit back. You don't have that in security because the bad guy could change tomorrow, and you could have a different type of threat that you didn't see before. But keeping certain assumptions constant and assuming kind of the most conservative way of doing an ROI, we actually did come up with a 21% ROI for this category. What's probably more impressive, that 21% is in fact the largest ROI among all of the categories for security technologies, including encryption. Now, there's another study that sometimes is a little confusing because it looks like it's the same study. It's a different study where we look at the cost of a data breach involving the loss or theft of personal information, thereby maybe violating policies for privacy and data protection. And this study was released in April 2013. This study was sponsored by Symantec. And here what we find is that the cost per record of data loss, and if you want to read the details, I encourage you to. We're very lonely up in Michigan, by the way, where I live in northern Michigan. I'm serious. So when you call, it's a big deal. So we want you to read the paper. It's like, it makes my day, though. I just sit by the phone waiting for it to ring. It's kind of scary. And the other thing about Ponemon Institute, we bring our dogs to the office. It's a very small company, you know, so basically we bring our dogs, and sometimes they're like our employees, the barking dogs in the background. We're known for that as well. So, and also some of our other employees bring now their dogs to the office. So it's a zoo, literally a zoo at the Ponemon Institute. So, and we do love dogs, so it's okay. And basically, if you kind of follow this data, there's cost savings of a strong incident response practice of $42 off of the $188 on average. So evidence, not necessarily the absolute fact, but evidence suggests from a couple of different places that if you do security intelligence right, you basically have the opportunity to save some dollars for your organization. So if you need an ROI and you want to convince your CIO or CEO, give us a holler. Now I'm going to talk about our survey results. The survey was fairly long. I forget how many questions. It was probably maybe 35 or 40 questions. We like 20 questions. Because for whatever reason, people see 30, they get nervous. But we trick people into doing the survey because they don't know it's going to be 30 questions. They think it might stop at any point in time. Those surveys that have that little thing at the bottom that show you're now 20% complete, we don't use that for a good reason, because our surveys are long and people say that, oh my God, I can't do this anymore. But we basically look at survey fatigue, and that's a quality issue that's very important to us. So in this particular sample, we actually had two samples that we consolidate. One is in the US and the other in the UK. And originally we were going to basically make a big deal about the big differences between these two countries, which we anticipated. And lo and behold, I'm happy to report that they're very close. I like when that happens because there would be no reason why the UK should be different or the US should be different from the UK. But basically, I think if we did expand this research to Germany and other countries, I think we probably would see some differences. And just in my own experience traveling through Europe or the world, Germany tends to be very, very concerned about forensics and getting to the root cause. So there's a great marketplace for, I think, a Landcope in a place like Germany, simply, and probably you're there already, but because it's just the culture lends itself to this kind of an activity. So in total, we have 674 individuals who've completed the survey. This is done over a short period of time, like a 2-week period of time, and then a couple of weeks to analyze the data. So we should have this finalized in the next week as a report. So again, this is confidential, not to leave the room or we'll have to kill you. Okay, you know, we're not going to kill anyone. We're kind and gentle people. Okay, current position, this is telling us about our sample. And the good news is we have a whole bunch of different pies and different size slices. The largest is this category called technician and staff. But if you basically divide the pie, you'll notice that supervisor and above represent more than half. And that's not random. That's by design. We wanted to have people who self-report having knowledgeable about incident response within their organization. Okay? The chain of command, again, I'm not surprised here at all, but typically the IT organization is the primary person that our respondents report through, including directly to a CISO in some cases or to a CTO. Now this issue called the Chief Risk Officer, I'm not sure if you've seen this, but this is a position on the rise. A lot of companies and financial service companies have had a Chief Risk Officer for ages. In fact, that might even be required by law in the US Treasury. But basically that role is now expanding to different industries. I was visiting an energy company, Chevron, on the West Coast, and they now moved their security, or they're in the process of moving their security operation to this new role called the Chief Risk Officer. And I think that's really smart because information risk or technology risk or cyber risk is a different type of risk, but the models that are used to define risk have similarities. They're not identical, but it makes good sense. We're starting to see more of that, not only in the United States, but globally. Now, in terms of industry, this is a good and bad slide. The good news is, wow, look at all the industries. So we basically can talk a little bit about it. The bad news is, wow, we don't have enough in any one of these slices to be able to say the effect of financial services versus the effect of transportation. Sometimes doing a carve out by industry can be helpful. We might be at the borderline with financial services and public sector, which is government, but not quite there. In terms of global headcount, well, we're looking at organizations that are normally about 1,000 or more people. That's kind of our sweet spot. But we also look at very large organizations by our standard, by Ponemon Institute standards, more than 75,000. That's a big monster company. That could be big, 300,000 plus, for example. But we also have smaller companies as well. Some of the Ponemon studies have been more focused more on the middle market or SMB, and there are differences. When you get below 250 people, the whole nature of security and how it's operationalized in companies change. So a lot of the results, even when we look at it small to medium size, just be warned that if you're looking at really small companies, 5 and 10 people or 100 people, you're looking at kind of a different animal. Some of these results are probably not too applicable. Okay, let's take a break. Let's relax. How many people were out late last night? How many people drank too much last night? Honest man, honest. There's always that one guy who says yes. I don't know why. Yeah, I'm usually that guy. I'm usually in the audience. If anybody asks me, I was a teetotaler yesterday. I was pretty good. As Phil knows, I like my red wine and my white wine simultaneously. Yeah, two hands. What were your hands for, right? Right and left. It works. It's great. Okay. So now I'm going to just jump in. There's a lot of stuff on this slide, so I apologize. But this is actually a whole bunch of questions, and I'm just giving you some of our stats at a glance. A lot of the details and the actual questions are kind of laid out in the report beautifully. But just to tell you about the CSIRT Cybersecurity Incident Response Team stats for our sample. Most companies, in fact 72% I think is the number all the way out here, most companies have 2 or more security experts. And experts in quotes. What is an expert? You're an expert, someone who basically is a practitioner in the IT security space assigned to CSIRT. Companies that supposedly have a fully functional CSIRT in place, 66% or 2/3 of our sample. The percent of CSIRT members with 1 or more professional certificates, 64%, that's pretty good. Companies, I think there are some people here who are probably like 10 certificates. Some of the business cards you have with all the certifications, you have to go to the back of the card in order to continue. Very impressive stuff. But if you look at this, we really do have some very, very good quality people and good quality companies participating in the study, which is exactly what we're hoping. The only point I want to bring up is this one at the very bottom at 15%. This is the percentage of the security budget dedicated to CSIRT activities. This is an extrapolated value. I don't know if 15% is good or bad. I think it's probably, we'll wait and see, but it could in fact be enough, an adequate amount of funding, probably isn't. But that's again 15% of the security budget, and security budgets tend to be below what you really need to have in order to operationalize good security. So 15% of a small number is not necessarily good. We'll look at that a little bit more later. Okay, security incident or breach experience for the sample, only 32% say that they did not have one in the last 2 years or 24 months. So that means 68%, if my math is correct, had 1 or more security breaches. So it's not a rare event. I love, sometimes you'll talk to we talk to insurance companies all the time. They make a big deal. Is this a man-made disaster? Is it a rare event? If it's a rare event, then the premiums are low. But in reality, it's not a rare event. Cyber attacks happen all the time. And you're going to say, well, not in my company. I believe, unless you have Phil as your CISO or Tom or someone like that, if getting to none means that you're just not aware of it. It doesn't mean you didn't get the attack. It means you didn't have LANCO, right? So because of that, you're at none. You say, oh, everything, ignorance is bliss. I'm a happy person. We don't have cyber problems. We're just cheap. We don't invest in security. Well, we've seen that before. Okay, this is again another way of looking at it. Instead of thinking back what happened, but what do we think will happen over the next 2 years or in the near future? And you'll notice that, do you believe you're going to have a security breach, a material security breach sometime in the near future? Again, 31% said no. Probably the same people in the 32% before. And they're living in la-la land. They basically, I think, are not paying attention to their organization. So what mitigates according to our respondents, potentially mitigates or lessens the likelihood of a material future security breach? That's a mouthful. And number one, it's good news, better incident response capabilities, better threat intelligence or IP reputation services, improved vulnerability audits and assessments, improved patch management. This is kind of an interesting one because I've been in the security industry, or more or less, for a long time, for many decades. And believe it or not, this has always been a problem. Patch management. You would think as soon as you get the security fix, you kind of stop the presses and you update. But easier said than done, because how do you take like your Oracle systems offline and say, I'll get back to it later. We'll have no availability. We'll have complete downtime for the next 2 weeks so that we can catch up and do our patch. It doesn't work that way. But anyway, these are kind of the factors that seem to be viewed as mitigating or helpful to the security breach issue. This is the percentage of IT security spending earmarked for incident response activities or CSIRT activities. Remember I said the 15%? This shows you the distribution. And not surprisingly, if the extrapolated average is 15%, we're really looking at a number between 10 and 20% of the total security budget that's basically earmarked or dedicated or approximately allocated to incident response. Okay? Now keep in mind, that's the, I probably should have said this before, that's the OpEx budget, not the CapEx budget. So for example, if someone makes a huge investment in a technology, $10 million tool, that could be amortized over normally 1 year, more than 1 year. That might get factored into the number, but these are the operating costs, not the capital expenditures. Has budget allocation for our activities changed over the past 20 months? Let me tell you to read this slide. I think this is the way you should read it. Forget about the stayed the same. These people aren't that interesting. But 34% of 100% said it has increased, but only 18% said it has decreased. So I look at the difference between these two things and I say, wow, that means that a much larger proportion of the sample said it's an increasing expenditure. Now why is that important? Because it means that somewhere there's an organization getting religion. They are starting to see the value of having a strong incident response process. And I think that explains the increase. Why the decrease? Because these people are taking drugs. I don't know why, actually. It could be any sunspots. It was the sunspot that caused them to hit the wrong button on their survey form. Yeah, it's funny. I have to tell you this story. I was at a conference and I was presenting with two other people from two different research companies. And this poor guy was presenting the results, and he basically he got through a slide, very complicated, beautiful slide. Like, you know, we have junky slides, but these were beautiful slides. And a moving thing, it was great. But they actually had the wrong data points. And the guy spent like his whole 40 minutes trying to explain something that couldn't be explained because there was an error. Finally, someone admitted, and one of the employees in that group, that company said, it's a mistake, forget about it, just move on. It was really terrible. So after that, I have nightmares that could be me. You know, that's gonna happen one of these days. Oh God. Okay, another issue on a serious note is this whole issue, and it's very serious, is third-party service providers. Now these people are your friends. These are the people you may want to bring in because you don't have the need to have fully dedicated expert lawyers on your team or expert forensics. Now you may, if you're a large enough organization, but some organizations, especially middle market, will basically want to outsource or co-source that function. And the number one category, if you are using a third party, is in the forensics and investigative area, which makes sense. This would also, I think, include people who do some pen testing as well, okay? Now law firms, wow, what a shift. Well, a lot of the time, a lot of these issues have legal consequences. And so it makes sense to bring in a law firm from time to time. And then the global audit and consulting firm, namely the big four accounting firms, and then the risk management firms, and then regional or local audit and consulting firms. So for the most part, it's a gamut. It's not necessarily one type of organization. But probably one of the more important findings is that 65% of companies say they do not engage a third party. So these are only the folks, this question is only for those people, the 35% said that they do. If you do use a vendor or a third-party provider, how are they used? And the number one response is to augment the skill set of your team. In other words, they're not doing something different. They're just basically an extension of what you do. Very few, in fact, I was very surprised. I think this was a surprising finding that only 10% said that these experts are the primary first responder to the incident. Because I know that when you don't have that expertise, you feel a little timid. And so you bring in an expert, and their primary role is to kind of get you started. But it doesn't seem to be the case. Our data suggests that it's more of an augmentation of your existing people and technology. Now, changing gears a little bit, this becomes a very important part of our survey because one of the things that we do is we try to understand what metrics are used by organizations to determine whether their incident response is adequate, not adequate, excellent, poor. And obviously what we want to do is make sure that, number one, we are using metrics. Metrics are very important. And obviously this slide says, when we ask the question, are operational metrics used? More than half, 50% and 55%, depending upon the type of metric, say no. So this is a real gap, right? I mean, how do you run anything in security without having some feedback that you're on the right track or you're not? Metrics are absolutely, if there's one message, moral of this story, it is metrics are good, they're very important, but choosing the right metric. There are a lot of junky metrics that lead you down the primrose path. You have to be very careful. Also, a lot of metrics may not be objective. So you think, oh, well, I did a whole lot here. I reduced the number of infected endpoints by implementing some solution, but the end result is that might be completely out of your control. And then you get a surprise one day where that stat that looks like it's going down suddenly goes up, boils over, okay? Now, there are 4 time-dependent operational metrics. This is boiling the ocean. I think Forrester came up with these definitions, and we incorporated it in our survey. But they're really the you kind of think about the world of metrics. Let's think about these metrics here. Again, these can be accomplished differently, and sometimes they have different names, but they're kind of doing this. One metric is the time to identify. How much time does it take to identify or detect an incident, that an incident had occurred? This is a big deal in the security field. I think the Verizon report said it's like 234 days on average before a company that is dealing with that breach, when the breach occurs, versus the time that it's discovered. That's a huge amount of time, and it gives a lot of leeway to the bad guys to work very slowly and surgically to actually exfiltrate data and do a lot of damage to your company, to your network and enterprise system. But again, what we see is mean time to identify. Then the mean time to know, that's the K, mean time to know the root cause of the incident. Then the mean time to fix, the mean time to actually fix it, the situation and restore service. And then the mean time to verify and confirm that the resolution that you say you fixed is in fact true. So these are kind of the 4 general types of time variables, operational metrics used by many companies. In terms of whether they're used or not used, the mean time to fix, which is the easiest, by the way, I was talking to Mike, is actually the one that is used by most of the majority, more than half, a very large percentage of our respondents. Mean time to identify, again, that's fairly easy, but mean time to know and mean time to verify are usually pretty complicated. So you notice that goes way down when we get to these variables. In terms of how long does it take on average, we did an extrapolation on elapsed hours. How many hours does it take to identify? 42 hours. Fix, 135 hours. Know, 160 hours. And to verify, 235. So think about it all this way. The longer the bigger these numbers, the more time it takes to get them resolved, the higher the cost, and the higher the probability that a security breach is a material or serious breach. Bad guys residing on your network for a nanosecond can cause a lot of damage, but basically residing on your network for hours can be a big, big problem. And getting these numbers near 0 is an impossibility. It's like quality. Having perfect quality is impossible, but getting it to a low state, lower than this, is probably a good idea. Who gets briefed about cyber incidents in the companies that participated? Who are the people who are kind of learning about this? The number one, the IT management. They basically are made aware of the security problems or the breaches, followed by compliance and audit, followed by the Office of General Counsel. Then we get to small numbers. We start dropping below 50%. HR, risk management, threat briefings disseminated broadly. This means nothing because that's a catch-all. Executive management at only 20%. And notice that board of directors at 12%. And when you look at that stat, you're probably saying, well, what does that mean? Why should I care? Because who is driving the train? It's probably executive management and board of directors. Who determines budget? Probably not IT management. It's probably the executive management and board of directors. Who decides on strategy and resolution? It's these people here. You don't want 20% for executive management. Briefing should be, remember, we're talking about telling them about the incident. And why does that happen? Why is the briefing rate so low? Well, what comes to mind immediately is the infamous bad news doesn't travel up, right? If you basically have bad news, it stops at this guy, the IT management level. Because God forbid the CEO should know that there are serious security breaches. So this is a big issue. Another way of looking at that question, who's in control, who participates in the IR process, not the briefings, just who's the active participant, it's the same cast of characters. Again, we see these numbers very, very low on board of directors and executive management. Now again, we do a lot of work with companies that have had a big data breach or security exploit, one that's noted in the newspaper, reputation damage, and we do briefings and we do meetings with CEOs and boards of directors. And in almost every case, after a big data breach occurs, you talk to these people, the directors and the CEOs, and their attitude is pretty much like, I can't believe it happened to us, or I didn't know, or no one told me it was that important, or why are you here? What's the meaning of my life? This is a very important issue, and we want to make sure that when we're developing our incident response process and plans, that we somehow have a way of engaging these people, the executive management and board of directors. This is a cultural issue. It's not true in every organization. If you deal with any financial service companies, okay, well, financial service organizations tend to be a little bit better at dealing with these issues. But then you look at other industries like manufacturers and logistics companies and so on, and there's this unfortunate gap. Okay, I know this is a lot of stuff here, a lot of data. I told you I'd give you just tons of data. I see your heads are bopping around like, what does this mean? Why is it red? Is blue good? Is red bad? About this is threat indicators and rules of engagement. Do your organization's incident investigations result in the production of threat indicators? And the good news is 43% say yes. The bad news is 54%, the majority say no. Threat indicators are really important because you're fixing an existing problem, that's true, but you also want to have information to prevent the next problem. And so you need to understand what are the threat indicators that you've learned when you fix this problem that you can apply to the future. That's being proactive in security. And 54% are saying no. That means they're not doing it right, because you want to learn and build threat indicators after you've completed your forensics and conducted your analysis. Here's another indicator that's important. Does your organization's IR team have clearly defined rules of engagement? And here's the important part, that enable them to act with autonomy in the event of an attack. This is one of the hardest things in the world. Is called delegation of responsibility. Giving a group like an IR group the responsibility to pull the plug or to do an expanded investigation. If you don't have that autonomy, you run the risk of having just a lousy incident response process. And yet 51% say they do not have that. I'm not too surprised. I'm not surprised at this autonomy issue. But basically, we want to get that 51% down to 0 if we can. Autonomy is good. Now the question is, after you do your threat indicators, do you share them? Are you a good citizen of the world and say, sure, I'll contact all the companies I know and let them know what we've learned. We'll just share it with you. Open door policy. Let me tell you what we learned when we solved this problem. Well, the number one response is, we never share, we never receive. We just operate as an island. Or information received from sharing partners, but not shared with them. That's like, the old, gee, tell me first and I'll tell you later. I'll get back to you. Okay, law enforcement and other government entities at 23%. We see that as mandated by certain rules like NERC and FERC in the energy industry. I like saying NERC and FERC. It sounds like it's a bad word, but it's really the abbreviation. I'm sorry, I'm punchy. I went out last night. No, I didn't go out last night. Okay, and then we also have law enforcement, various search and industries. Okay, let's kind of move a little quicker. Does the IR program include procedures for managing insider threats? And this is an important issue too. If you're concerned about the reputational effect of a big, serious cyber attack, you need to focus on public relations as well. And we notice that on the public relations side, most incident response processes and teams don't even think about this. And yet it should be part of the process. You should say, look, in the event that the breach is now known to the media, how do we communicate to the media? I always remember the famous TJX. You remember the TJX story? And what I remember most about it was they interviewed 3 different people who said they were the CISO. I swear to you, there were 3 people. They said, he's the Chief Information Security Officer. And it was 3 different people, and they had 3 different stories. One guy said, yeah, it's not 23 million records, it's a lot less. Another guy said, oh, it's a lot more. And then I think the third guy really blew it, and he said, oh, everyone around here is so incompetent. And it was like in the Boston Globe, that quote, everyone around here is so incompetent. It was great. That guy lost his job. He's gone. He's now a farmer in central Massachusetts. Okay. Okay. What are the most effective security tools for detecting cyber incidents? Now, this is actually a good fact here. Based on the way we constructed the survey, we gave people a list, and it was a lot longer than this list. And the top 5 are analysis of Netflow or packet capture, SIM, intrusion prevention, detection, IP reputation with threat feed services, and antivirus. I'm not sure how antivirus shows up here, but basically antivirus is important, but it's not necessarily as important as some of these other tools. Now, the issue about IR technology and governance and people, it doesn't really mean anything unless you test it, and unless you can demonstrate in advance of a crisis that you have the team ready to deal with it, that you're not reactive, you're proactive, and you have the right tools available. And so when we asked the question, is IR readiness tested, yes or no, the answer was a lot of no's, right? You can infer it from these percentages. Not on a regular schedule, which means no, 29%, but then on an ongoing basis. That's your nirvana state is only 21%. So really, it's on an ongoing basis. Now, when you test it, you don't necessarily want to test it like with absolute precision. You might want to do more of a fire drill. Like, Monday morning, what would happen? Friday night, what would happen? I know it's a pain to do it that way, but you want to do that on a regular interval as much as you can. You want to say you do 3 a month or 3 a year, whatever it is. Not doing it is it's never a good idea. And you don't want to wait till like an annual or semi-annual basis. How is log information collected for SIM systems? From all network security devices, 61%, from all client PCs, 52%, from all application servers, from all identity management infrastructure, we don't use SIM, and from all network infrastructure components, and other is just that 1%. Where does full packet capture happen? Now, this is one of the controversies of our study. And this is the issue where we know that pervasively through the network is almost impossible to do in the state of the world. But when we asked the survey, a lot of people selected that because I think they thought any traffic, any anomalous or gratuitous traffic in the network that's observed and collected would fall into this category. But we don't know that. And we actually were trying to figure out why we got such a high misunderstanding. But we think the word pervasively was a poor choice. Then full packet capture, then at all data centers and all network egress points. How is Netflow collected and stored? This is very important. At the data center level, Netflow is not collected and stored. Shame on those organizations, from core switches and routers, from access switches and routers. And again, if we had to do the survey, some of these questions, which are most important to NetLandCope, I think could have probably been better defined. How are system images taken and used for forensic analysis? The number one response, it's not systematic, it's really an on-demand activity. Or, with big problem here, system images are not collected or taken for forensic analysis. And then another way of looking at the data that we've collected is how many days of information are you collecting for network intelligence? And we look at system logs, full packet capture, and days of Netflow. And it's quite a bit. When you think about it, it's about a week to a month. That's a lot of information just sitting out there. Okay, so what did we learn? Well, we learned once again, after many, many years of being in the security industry, it's not one thing. In order to do, if you're going to do incident response right, it really does start with this, people. We know that a lot of organizations are struggling to recruit people that have the skill set necessary to do cybersecurity related activities well. And as a result, without these people, it's hard to do the CSIRT at the A level. You may get to a B+, but not to the A- or A+ level. Process. This is a cultural issue. As much as anything else, it's basically getting an organization to say, this is important. It needs to be properly funded. And most importantly, I'm going to get the CEO and the senior level executives involved in that process. They're going to be part of briefings, and they're going to basically take some responsibility for the messes that may exist. And of course, last and never least, technology. It's too hard to do this manually unless you have like 3 people in your organization. When you have a decent sized company, understanding network traffic and searching for those anomalies or gratuitous traffic issues is very, 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 it's impossible to do it manually actually. And that's where you have to, that visibility is really essential if you're going to do it right. Okay? Now, I'm sorry about this slide, but now I have to talk about it. It's a survey. So with all surveys, there are limitations and caveats. We take surveys very seriously, even though I was joking during my presentation. Non-response bias is always a problem. In other words, the people who respond are different than the people who don't. We test for it, we try to evaluate it, we try to even control for it, but it happens. Sampling frame bias, the folks who we invite to participate in Ponemon studies are not necessarily representative of the whole universe of people in the IT or IT security field. And then finally, and this is the hardest one to fix, it's the self-reported results. When you give people a survey, not that they're deliberately out to distort it, but there's a halo effect in some questions, and you just have to kind of read it, and if things look a little bit screwy, you have to kind of do a deeper dive and try to figure out what is the right answer. But self-reported results are a big problem for all surveys.